Four young German airmen climbed into their Heinkel bomber on a frozen December morning in 1944, tasked with what seemed like a routine supply run. Their engines roared to life at 0630 hours. Radio crackled with final clearance, and they disappeared into the winter clouds over Bavaria. No distress signal, no crash reported, no wreckage found. Just 4 men and 30 tons of aircraft erased from existence. Then in 2023, melting alpine ice revealed twisted metal that would uncover a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of the Reich. A secret so dangerous that an entire crew was sacrificed to protect it. The winter of 1944 was the coldest Europe had seen in decades. Snow blanketed the Bavarian Alps in layers so thick that entire villages disappeared beneath white silence. For the airmen of Camp Geschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's most secretive bomber unit, the brutal weather was just another obstacle in a war that was already lost. Everyone knew it, though no one dared say it aloud. The Third Reich was collapsing, the Eastern Front crumbling under Soviet advance, Allied bombers turning German cities to ash night after night. But for 4 men assigned to Heinkel, He-111 bomber number 584, December 18, 1944 would be their last morning alive. The crew assembled in the pre-dawn darkness at Oberpfaffenhofen airfield, 15 kilometers southwest of Munich. The base was one of dozens scattered across southern Germany, each one operating under layers of secrecy that had become standard in the war's final year. Aircraft came and went at odd hours, their missions undisclosed, their destinations classified. Ground crews learned not to ask questions. Pilots learned to follow orders without debate. This culture of silence would prove fatal for the crew of Raven 584. Captain Friedrich Weber, the pilot, was 28 years old, ancient by Luftwaffe standards in late 1944. Most pilots his age were already dead. Shot down over France or Russia or England, their names carved on memorials that no one had time to visit. Weber had survived through a combination of skill, caution, and luck that had to run out eventually. He came from a family of teachers in Hamburg, a city that no longer existed in any recognizable form after the Allied firestorm. Raids of July 1943. His parents had died in those raids, burned alive along with 40,000 other civilians. Weber had received a telegram while on leave, too late to even attend a funeral because there were no bodies to bury, just ash scattered across ruined streets. The loss had changed him. Where once he'd believed in the cause, in defending the fatherland from its enemies, now he just flew because refusing meant execution. His crew noticed the change, the way his eyes had gone distant, the way he no longer sang the old squadron songs or joked during briefings. But they also noticed that his hands remained steady on the controls, that his judgment under pressure had never wavered. Weber was known for bringing damaged bombers home through impossible conditions, for making split-second decisions that saved his crew's lives. His men trusted him completely, even when that trust would lead them into a trap. Lieutenant Hans Richter, the navigator, was just 23, but his mathematical mind had earned him a reputation as one of the best route planners in KG 200 before the war. He'd been studying astronomy at the University of Berlin, dreaming of mapping stars instead of bombing coordinates. His dissertation topic had been the orbital mechanics of binary star systems, an esoteric subject that seemed impossibly distant from the blood and fire of total war. Richter kept a small notebook where he sketched constellations during night missions, a quiet rebellion against the violence he'd been conscripted to facilitate. His letters home to his younger sister Eva spoke of returning to finish his studies, of a future beyond the war where he could stand under a telescope dome instead of a bomber's canopy. Eva was 16, still in school despite the disruptions, still believing that her brilliant older brother would come home and teach her about the cosmos. She kept every letter he sent, tied with a ribbon in a small wooden box their mother had given her. The last letter, dated December 15, 1944, arrived 3 days after Hans disappeared. In it, he wrote, "The stars look different from up here, Liebling. Sometimes I feel like I'm already among them, already free of all this. Whatever happens, remember that the universe is bigger than any war, and the light from distant stars has been traveling for millennia to reach us. That's real. That's eternal. Everything else is just noise. Ava would keep that letter for the rest of her life, reading it until the paper wore thin, trying to understand what her brother had meant about already being among the stars. Sergeant Otto Baumann, the bombardier and radio operator, was the oldest crew member at 32. A postal worker from Leipzig before the war transformed him into a warrior. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1941, believing the propaganda about defending the fatherland, about the necessity of total war against enemies who sought Germany's destruction. 3 years of watching cities burn had stripped away his illusions. He'd seen what 1,000 bomber raids did to civilian populations. He'd seen the bodies pulled from rubble, the children clutching dolls in death, the elderly who'd suffocated in basement shelters when firestorms consumed all the oxygen. Baumann had stopped believing in the war by 1943, but desertion meant execution, not just for him but potentially for his family. So he flew mission after mission, counting the days until it would finally be over, praying that his wife Greta and their 2 daughters would survive whatever apocalypse was coming. He spoke often of his family, showed photographs to anyone who would look, talked about the small apartment in Leipzig where they waited for him. His crewmates called him Old Otto, though at 32 he was hardly ancient. The nickname was affectionate, a recognition that he represented something they all hoped to become: survivors. Baumann had a dry sense of humor that kept morale up during the worst moments. When a Kadak fire got too close, he'd comment that the enemy was trying to part my hair. When fighters attacked, he'd calmly note that someone's in a bad mood today. His unflappable demeanor was a gift to his crewmates, who drew strength from his refusal to show fear. But at night, alone in his bunk, Baumann wrote letters to his daughters that he never sent, knowing they were too honest, too desperate. "Forgive your papa for not being there," one letter read. "Forgive him for all the things he's done that you'll never know about. Forgive him for following orders when he should have refused." Those letters were found in his locker after the crew disappeared, each one dated and carefully preserved. Greta received them 6 months later, delivered by a sympathetic officer who broke protocol to ensure a grieving widow got her husband's final words. She read them once, wept for 3 days, then locked them away where her daughters would never find them. Some truths were too heavy for children to carry. The youngest crew member was Corporal Stefan Lange, a flight engineer and gunner, barely 19 years old. He'd been pulled from Hitler Youth and thrown into military service with 6 weeks of training, just enough to teach him which buttons not to push and how to clear a jammed machine gun. Lange was terrified of flying, but even more terrified of showing fear, caught in the impossible bind of adolescence and war. He came from a small farming village in Thuringia, where his parents still tended fields and pretended the war wasn't devouring their country. Stefan's father had lost a leg at Verdun in the First World War, had spent 25 years warning anyone who'd listened that another war would destroy Germany completely. When Stefan's conscription notice arrived in early 1944, his father had gotten drunk for the first time in 2 decades and cried. "They'll grind you up like we were ground up," he'd said. And for what? For what? Stefan had no answer then, and in the months since, he'd found none. He just did what he was told, tried to stay alive, and wrote weekly letters home filled with lies about how safe he was, how the war would be over soon, how he'd come home and help with the harvest. His mother saved those letters in a drawer in the kitchen, pulling them out to read whenever fear overwhelmed her. After Stefan disappeared, she continued setting a place for him at dinner, insisting he was just delayed, just missing, that any day now he'd walk through the door with that embarrassed smile he got when caught in a lie. She maintained this ritual until dementia took her memories in the 1980s, blessing her with a forgetfulness that was kinder than truth. Their mission briefing came at 06:00 hours on December 18th. The 4 men sat in a cold hangar, breath misting in the frigid air, while their commanding officer, Major Klaus Steiner, outlined what he called a priority transport operation. Steiner was a career officer, 42 years old, with the kind of military bearing that came from 2 decades of service. He'd been a fighter pilot in the 1930s, transitioned to bombers, survived campaigns in Poland and France, before being assigned to KG-200's administrative command. By late 1944, he was more bureaucrat than warrior, shuffling papers and issuing orders he didn't always understand. The briefing was unusually terse, even by KG-200 standards. Weber and his crew were to fly southeast into the Austrian Alps, deliver sealed cargo to a facility near Salzburg, designated as Depot 7, and return before nightfall. The route would take them through some of the most treacherous mountain terrain in Europe, threading through passes where winter storms could materialize in minutes, where downdrafts could slam an aircraft into a cliff face before a pilot could react. But the weather forecast predicted clear skies and minimal Allied air activity. With luck, they'd be home by 1400 hours, in time for a hot meal and perhaps a few hours of sleep before the next mission. What struck the crew as odd, what made Weber's instincts start screaming warnings he couldn't quite articulate, was the cargo itself. Most supply runs carried ammunition, medical equipment, or fuel, items whose weight and contents were clearly documented for flight safety reasons. A pilot needed to know exactly what he was carrying and how it was distributed to maintain proper trim and balance. But the cargo loaded into their Heinkel that morning consisted of 6 unmarked steel crates, each one approximately 2 meters long, 1 meter wide, and half a meter deep. The only marking on each crate was a single word stenciled in red paint: Geheim, secret. The crates were unusually heavy. Weber watched as a crane lifted each one into the bomber's cargo bay, noting how the steel cables strained under the weight. He tried to estimate the mass, calculating how it would affect takeoff distance and fuel consumption. When he approached the loading supervisor with questions about weight distribution, the man simply shrugged. "Not my concern, Hauptmann. Classified cargo, classified destination. You just fly it where you're told." 2 SS officers supervised the loading, standing apart from the Luftwaffe ground crew with that distinctive arrogance that had become the SS trademark. They wore the black uniforms with silver insignia, their faces hard and cold in the winter dawn. One of them, an Obersturmführer who looked barely older than Lange, kept a hand on his holstered pistol the entire time, as if expecting trouble. The other, a Hauptsturmführer with dueling scars on his left cheek, smoked French cigarettes and watched the loading with eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. Weber tried to ask about the cargo's contents, framing it as a safety concern. "Herr Hauptsturmführer, if we encounter turbulence or need to make emergency maneuvers, I need to know if this cargo could shift or if there are any special handling requirements." The SS officer took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaled smoke into the frozen air, and replied in a voice empty of warmth, "Your only requirement, Hauptmann, is to follow orders. The cargo is secure. You will deliver it to the coordinates provided. You will not discuss this mission with anyone. These orders come from the highest authority." Even more unusual was the fact that their radio equipment had been upgraded the night before. Weber learned about this only when Baumann mentioned it during their pre-flight inspection. A technician Weber didn't recognize had arrived around 2,300 hours, claiming to have orders to install new communication gear. The technician had worked for 3 hours in the bomber's radio compartment, then left without filing any paperwork or logbook entry. When Baumann tested the radio during pre-flight checks, everything seemed normal. But he noticed something odd: a small additional box installed behind the main transmitter, connected to the aircraft's electrical system with wires that led somewhere into the airframe. "What is this?" Baumann asked, pointing to the mysterious device. The ground crew chief looked at it, frowned, then shrugged. "Above my pay grade, Sergeant. If the SS is involved, I know better than to ask questions." "Everything tested functional?" Baumann confirmed that it did, though his instincts, honed by 3 years of technical work, told him something was wrong. The device looked like some kind of receiver or relay, but its purpose was unclear. He made a mental note to examine it more closely during the flight, if time permitted. Weber gathered his crew for a final check before boarding. "Listen," he said quietly, ensuring no one else could hear. "This mission feels wrong. The cargo, the SS involvement, the modified radio, all of it. We're going to follow orders, because refusing means a bullet. But stay alert. If anything starts to go sideways, we act together. No heroics, no assumptions. Clear." His 3 crew members nodded, their faces reflecting the same unease Weber felt. They'd all flown enough missions to recognize when something didn't add up. At precisely 0630 hours, Heinkel 584 roared down the snow-packed runway and lifted into the gray December sky. The bomber climbed steadily, its twin Jumo 211 engines, droning with the familiar rhythm that had accompanied thousands of missions over the skies of Europe. Weber radioed their departure to base control, his voice professional and calm. Raven 584 airborne, proceeding to waypoint Alpha, all systems nominal. The transmission was acknowledged with a terse, "Roger, Raven 584. Report at checkpoint intervals." Heil Hitler. Then silence, broken only by the steady drone of engines and the whistle of wind over the airframe. The flight path took them southeast over the Bavarian countryside, gradually climbing toward the alpine peaks that rose like frozen teeth against the horizon. Below, the landscape transformed from rolling farmland to dense forest to the first snow-covered slopes of the mountains. Small villages appeared as clusters of dark shapes against white snow, their chimneys trailing wood smoke into the morning air. Normal people living normal lives, Weber thought, unaware that a bomber carrying secrets passed overhead. Richter navigated with precision, calling out course corrections while monitoring their altitude and fuel consumption. They had to maintain exact parameters through the mountain passes where margin for error was measured in meters, not kilometers. One miscalculation, one moment of inattention, could send them smashing into a cliff face or stalling into a spin they'd never recover from. But Richter was good at his job, perhaps the best navigator Weber had ever flown with. His calculations were invariably correct, his course plots efficient and safe. If they were going to die on this mission, Weber thought grimly, it wouldn't be because of navigation errors. 40 minutes into the flight, as they approached the Austrian border, the radio situation became strange. Baumann had been monitoring standard Luftwaffe frequencies, listening to routine traffic from other units. Nothing unusual, just the normal chatter of a military aviation network, weather updates, navigation checks, fuel status reports. Then, at exactly 0710 hours, all the chatter stopped. Every frequency went silent simultaneously, as if someone had thrown a master switch and disconnected them from the rest of the world. "That's odd," Baumann muttered, adjusting his headset and checking connections. He tried multiple frequencies, both primary and backup channels. Nothing but static, except for their own internal communication system. "Hauptmann, we've lost all external radio contact. I'm not receiving any traffic on any frequency." Weber felt cold certainty settle in his stomach. Radio problems happened, certainly. Equipment failed. Atmospheric conditions interfered with transmissions. But for all frequencies to go silent simultaneously, that wasn't mechanical failure. That was deliberate. Before Weber could respond, the radio crackled to life with an unexpected transmission. A voice he didn't recognize, speaking German but with an accent he couldn't quite place. Austrian, perhaps, or Swiss. "Raven 584. This is control. Divert to secondary coordinates. New destination transmitting now." Richter quickly copied down the coordinates as they came through, then cross-referenced them with his charts. His face went pale. "Hauptmann, these coordinates put us much deeper into the mountains, at least 80 kilometers off our original course. There's no Depot 7 at this location. In fact, there's nothing at these coordinates, according to any map I have." Weber keyed his microphone. "Control, this is Raven 584. Request confirmation of course change." Original mission parameters indicated. The radio went completely dead. Not static, not interference, just absolute silence. Baumann frantically worked his equipment, checking connections, trying backup systems, switching between every frequency in their range. Nothing. The bomber's radio had been reduced to useless metal and wire. "They've cut us off," Richter said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Hauptmann, someone doesn't want us communicating with anyone. Weber's mind raced through possibilities. Equipment failure could explain some of this, but the timing was too precise. First, all external traffic disappears. Then they receive a course change to an unknown location. Then their transmitter is disabled before they can question the orders. This wasn't malfunction. This was orchestrated. Otto, Weber said, his voice deliberately calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. That device installed in the radio bay last night. Examine it. Right now. Baumann unbuckled and moved back to the radio equipment, pulling off access panels to expose the wiring. What he found confirmed their worst fears. The mysterious box was indeed a relay device, but not for communication. It was a receiver connected to the bomber's ignition system, the fuel pumps, and multiple other critical circuits. With the right radio signal, someone could shut down their aircraft remotely. Mein Gott, Baumann whispered. Hauptmann, this is a kill switch. Someone can turn off our engines from the ground. They've sabotaged us. Lange, listening from his engineer's position, felt his stomach drop. Can you disconnect it? Baumann was already working, pulling out the wire cutters from his toolkit. I can try, but if it's booby-trapped or if cutting the wrong wire triggers it. He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what would happen if the engines quit at their current altitude over mountainous terrain. Weber made a command decision. Do it. We're already compromised. If they wanted us dead right now, we'd be dead. They're hurting us somewhere, which means we still have time. As Baumann carefully began disconnecting the kill switch, Weber turned to Richter. Plot a course to those secondary coordinates they gave us, but also plot escape routes. Every airfield within our fuel range, every emergency landing site. If we need to deviate, I want options. The bomber continued southeast, climbing higher into the Alps as the peaks closed in around them. The weather, which had been clear at takeoff, began to deteriorate. Clouds rolled in from the west, thick and gray, reducing visibility to a few hundred meters. Ice began forming on the wings, adding weight and disrupting airflow. Weber fought the controls, trying to maintain altitude while Lange frantically worked to clear ice from critical surfaces. The temperature inside the aircraft plummeted. The men's breath came in frozen clouds. This storm wasn't in the forecast, Richter said, checking his meteorological notes. They said clear skies all morning. This is a winter front that should have been 200 kilometers north of our position. Weber understood immediately. Even the weather forecast had been a lie, designed to get them airborne without concerns about conditions. Whoever was running this operation had thought of everything, orchestrating their deaths with the precision of a military operation. Baumann, working desperately on the kill switch, finally succeeded in disconnecting the main power feeds. I've cut it out, he reported. If they try to trigger it now, nothing will happen. But Hauptmann, I don't like what this means. Someone went to extraordinary effort to install this device, to get us up here, to isolate us. We're being deliberately, the engines coughed, sputtered, and died. Both of them simultaneously. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the whistle of wind and the terrified breathing of four men who understood they were about to die. Baumann, what happened? Weber shouted, fighting controls that had suddenly become sluggish as hydraulic pressure dropped. I disconnected the kill switch. This shouldn't be possible. But it was possible, Weber realized, because they'd installed redundant systems. The box Baumann had disconnected was a decoy, or perhaps a backup. The real kill switch was somewhere else, hidden deeper in the aircraft systems, activated by a radio signal they'd received minutes or hours ago, set on a timer or triggered remotely. The Heinkel began to descend, no longer flying but gliding, a 30-ton piece of metal falling through the sky with slightly more grace than a stone. Weber immediately began emergency procedures, trying to restart the engines, switching fuel tanks, checking every system. Nothing worked. The engines were dead, and they were dropping toward the mountains at approximately 15 meters per second. Altitude 3,200 meters and decreasing, Richter called out, his voice remarkably steady for a man facing imminent death. Hauptmann, at current descent rate, we have approximately 4 minutes before impact. Weber scanned the terrain through breaks in the clouds. Rocky peaks, frozen glaciers, vertical cliff faces. No good options. Only degrees of catastrophic. "Listen to me," Weber said over the internal communication system, his voice steady despite everything. "When we hit, stay with the aircraft if you're able. If any of us survive the impact, we stay together. We find out what's in those cargo crates that was worth murdering an entire crew." His men acknowledged the order, their responses calm, professional. They were going to die like soldiers, not victims. Baumann had one final act of defiance. He grabbed the fire axe from its mount and systematically destroyed the radio equipment, smashing the transmitter, the receiver, and especially the mysterious device that had killed them. If anyone found the wreckage, they wouldn't recover intact sabotage equipment. Then he pulled out his personal effects, the photographs of Greta and the girls, and stuffed them into his flight jacket. Maybe, somehow, they'd make it home. Maybe his family would know he'd been thinking of them at the end. Richter pulled out his navigation logs and personal notebook, the one with constellation sketches. He carefully tore out the pages documenting their true course, the secondary coordinates they'd been ordered to, and folded them into a small packet that he shoved deep into his jacket. Evidence, if anyone cared to look. Proof that they'd been sent off course, that this hadn't been an accident or pilot error. Lange, the youngest, the one who should have been in a classroom or helping his father in the fields instead of dying in a bomber over the Alps, pulled out his letters from home and held them like a talisman. His hands shook and tears froze on his cheeks, but he didn't sob or scream. He just clutched those letters and prayed to a God he wasn't sure existed anymore. Praying for his parents, for his village, for a world where 19-year-olds didn't die in metal coffins tumbling from the sky. Weber kept fighting the controls, trying to guide their dying aircraft toward the least deadly impact zone he could find. The Heinkel was dropping fast now, ice-covered wings providing almost no lift. The bomber nothing more than a very expensive glider with terrible aerodynamic properties. Through the snow and clouds, he caught glimpses of the terrain rushing up to meet them. A glacier basin, relatively flat, surrounded by peaks. It was the best he could do. "Brace for impact," Weber shouted. 30 seconds. The crew assumed crash positions, heads down, hands locked behind their necks, bodies tensed against the violence about to be inflicted. The roar of wind over the airframe grew louder as their speed increased. Through the windscreen, Weber saw nothing but white, a wall of snow and ice and cloud that filled his vision. Then impact. The Heinkel struck the glacier slope at approximately 0751 hours, December 18th, 1944, hitting at an angle of roughly 30 degrees with an estimated velocity of 280 kilometers per hour. The right engine tore away from the wing on first contact, tumbling down the mountain in a shower of metal and ice and ignited fuel. The left wing crumpled like paper, folding back along the fuselage. The nose section, where Weber fought the controls until the last second, compressed by 2 meters in an instant, the instrument panel driving backward into the pilot's position. The fuselage plowed through snow and rock, shedding pieces with each violent bounce. The tail section separated, spiraling away to embed itself in a crevasse 200 meters from the main wreckage. Inside the bomber, the crew was thrown against bulkheads with forces that broke bones and ruptured organs. Weber died instantly, his chest crushed by the collapsing cockpit. Richter survived the initial impact, but suffered massive internal injuries, dying within minutes as blood filled his lungs. Baumann and Lange, positioned further back in the aircraft, had fractionally better protection. Baumann lived for perhaps an hour, conscious but paralyzed. Staring at the photographs of his family, his feeling left his body from the waist down and then from the chest up, his breathing becoming shallower until it finally stopped. Lange, the youngest, the one who'd been most afraid, was knocked unconscious by the impact and never woke up, dying in his sleep as hypothermia claimed him. It was, perhaps, the kindest death among them. The 6 cargo crates broke loose during the crash sequence, bursting open and spilling their contents across the glacier basin. Documents scattered in the wind, many sailing hundreds of meters before settling into crevasses or being buried by snow. Gold and diamonds scattered like seeds across white ice. Scientific documents and research data came to rest in positions where they'd remained frozen for nearly 8 decades. Then silence. The kind of absolute silence that exists only in high mountain wilderness. No engines, no radio traffic, no human voices. Just the whisper of wind across ice and the occasional crack of settling metal as the wreckage cooled in the sub-zero temperatures. The 4 men were dead, their bodies already beginning the long process of freezing solid. The broken remains of Heinkel 584 lay scattered across a glacier basin at 2,800 meters elevation, surrounded by peaks that would keep this secret for 79 years. And somewhere far below, in the valley where a convoy had waited, SS officers received confirmation that the mission had been completed. Raven 584 had been erased. The cargo that could have exposed the highest levels of the Reich's criminal apparatus was now safely buried under alpine ice, along with the witnesses who might have asked inconvenient questions. The operation had been a complete success. For 79 years, the glacier kept its secrets. Snow accumulated season after season, burying the wreckage deeper beneath layers of ice and time. The families of the 4 crew members received telegrams informing them that their loved ones were missing in action, presumed dead in a training accident. No details were provided. No bodies were recovered. Just the standard wartime condolences and a promise that the Reich would honor their sacrifice. Weber's elderly parents in Hamburg received nothing at all. They died in the firestorms of July 1943, 16 months before their son's death. Friedrich never knew he was already an orphan when he climbed into that bomber for the last time. Richter's sister Eva kept his last letter framed on her wall, the one about stars and eternity and the universe being bigger than war. She read it every night before bed for 40 years, trying to understand what her brilliant brother had meant about already being among the stars, already free. She never married, never left Berlin, spent her life teaching astronomy to children and telling them about her brother who'd loved the stars so much he'd become one. Baumann's wife Greta raised their daughters alone, working 3 jobs to keep them fed in the chaos of post-war Germany. She never remarried, claiming that Otto would come home someday, that he was just lost, not dead. She believed it fiercely, irrationally, maintaining a place for him at the table, refusing to move from their Leipzig apartment, even when the city became part of East Germany and life got harder. She believed it until her final breath in 1978, dying while holding his photograph, whispering his name, waiting for a man who'd been dead for 34 years. Their daughters, Helga and Marguerite, grew up with a ghost for a father, a set of photographs and stories, and an empty chair at dinner. They learned not to ask their mother about him, learned that some grief was too deep to disturb. When the wall fell in 1989 and records became accessible, they tried to find information about their father's death, but the files were incomplete, contradictory. Training accident, the official record said. No details available. They'd almost given up hope of ever knowing the truth when, in 2023, they received a call from the Austrian Federal Police. Lange's parents held out hope the longest. Every year, on Stefan's birthday, April 12th, they set an extra place at the table, laid out his favorite meal, and waited. They did this even as the war ended, even as East Germany became their new reality, even as neighbors whispered about the crazy old couple who thought their dead son would come home. They did it until both were too old to remember why they did it, their minds clouded by age, their son forever 19 in their fading memories, forever young and afraid and brave. The war ended. Germany was divided, reunified, rebuilt. The Cold War came and went. The Soviet Union collapsed. The European Union formed. The 20th century became history, then distant history, then something grandchildren learned about in school and couldn't quite imagine as real. The Berlin Wall fell, and with it, the Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for half a century. Technology transformed the world. Men walked on the moon. Computers shrank from room-sized machines to devices that fit in pockets. The internet connected the globe. But high in the Austrian Alps, sealed in ice, 4 men remained at their posts, frozen in the positions where impact had thrown them. The calendar had rolled forward nearly 8 decades. But for Weber, Richter, Baumann, and Lange, time had stopped at 0751 hours on December 18, 1944. They were still 28 and 23 and 32 and 19. Still following orders, still trusting that their mission served some purpose. Still unaware that they'd been murdered by the system they served. The glacier that entombed them was ancient, thousands of years old, formed during the last ice age when sheets of ice kilometers thick covered the Alps. It had flowed slowly downslope at a rate of a few meters per year, carrying the wreckage of Heinkel 584 with it, embedding it deeper in the ice matrix. To the glacier, the Bono was just another piece of debris, no different from rocks and trees and the occasional lost mountaineer. The ice didn't care about human drama or wartime secrets or 4 young men whose lives had been stolen. It just flowed slowly, inexorably, according to laws of physics that predated humanity and would outlast it. But glaciers, ancient as they are not eternal. And in the early 21st century, something changed. The climate began warming at a rate unprecedented in human history. Global temperatures rose year after year. Arctic sea ice melted. Greenland's ice sheets retreated. And in the Alps, glaciers that had existed for millennia began disappearing at alarming rates, losing dozens of meters per year, exposing landscapes that hadn't seen sunlight since the Pleistocene. Scientists monitoring this transformation saw it as a climate catastrophe, evidence of humanity's impact on planetary systems. But they also saw something else, a window into the past. As glaciers melted, they revealed artifacts from bygone eras. Medieval trade routes became visible. Bronze Age tools emerged from the ice. Bodies of climbers lost decades ago appeared, preserved as if they'd died yesterday. The Alps were giving up their dead and their secrets. The discovery that would finally bring Raven 584 home began not with the aircraft, but with climate research. Dr. Anna Hoffmann, a glaciologist from the University of Innsbruck, had been leading a research team on the Hohtauern Range since 2018, documenting the rapid retreat of alpine glaciers. Her work was depressing, showing losses that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. Glaciers that had existed for 10,000 years were disappearing within her lifetime. In the summer of 2023, Dr. Hoffmann's team was conducting a survey of the Grunwald Glacier, one of dozens in the region showing catastrophic retreat. They were using ground-penetrating radar to map the ice depth and establish baseline measurements for future comparisons. The work was routine, technical, the kind of methodical data collection that forms the foundation of climate science. It was a Tuesday morning, August 15th, when one of her graduate students, Thomas Keller, spotted something unusual in the radar returns. "Dr. Hoffmann, you should look at this," Thomas said, pointing to his screen. The radar showed a large anomaly embedded in the ice, approximately 40 meters below the current surface. It was too geometric to be natural, too large to be mountaineering equipment. "What am I looking at?" Hoffmann asked, studying the data. The anomaly measured roughly 16 meters long, 20 meters wide, including what appeared to be wing structures. "That's an aircraft," she said with certainty. "World War II era, based on the size and shape. We need to contact authorities immediately." Within 48 hours, Austrian federal police and military historians arrived at the site. What began as a routine investigation of found aircraft wreckage quickly became something far more significant. Initial surveys confirmed that this wasn't just scattered debris from a crash. This was an almost completely intact bomber, preserved in the glacier like an insect trapped in amber. The extreme cold and constant ice pressure had crushed portions of the aircraft. But the overall structure remained identifiable. Dr. Klaus Reinhardt, a military aviation historian from Vienna and one of the world's leading experts on Luftwaffe operations, identified the aircraft within hours of examining the first exposed sections. "Heinkel He 111, he said with certainty, running his hand along the distinctive elliptical wing platform that was just becoming visible. "Model based on the wing modifications and what's left of the engine mounts. Late war production, probably 1943 or 1944. The really interesting question is what it was doing up here." This area was well away from any standard Luftwaffe flight paths or known operational zones. The excavation continued through late August and into September. It was painstaking work, the kind usually reserved for archaeological sites containing artifacts far older than 8 decades. Engineers used precision ice-melting equipment and careful mechanical excavation to expose the wreckage section by section. Every piece was photographed, measured, and documented before removal. Dr. Hoffman's team worked alongside the historians, analyzing the ice layers that had preserved the aircraft, dating them to understand exactly when the crash had occurred and how the wreckage had been sealed away. As they worked deeper into the ice, more of the bomber's structure became visible. The tail section, relatively intact, despite being separated from the fuselage. Pieces of wing with faded Luftwaffe markings, still visible beneath corrosion. The twisted remains of Jumo 211 engines. And then, on September 3rd, they reached the main fuselage section. That's when they found the crew. The excavation team had been expecting this, of course. Aircraft wreckage usually meant human remains, especially when the crash site was in such a remote location that no rescue or recovery would have been possible. But knowing intellectually that there would be, bodies didn't prepare them for the emotional impact of seeing 4 young men who'd been frozen in time for 79 years. The bodies were remarkably preserved by the ice, a phenomenon known to science but still disturbing when encountered. Their features were frozen in expressions that ranged from concentration to terror. Captain Weber was still at the controls, or what remained of them, his hands locked on the yoke, his face showing the intense focus of a pilot fighting to save his aircraft until the last possible second. Lieutenant Richter was slumped in the navigator's position, his arms wrapped around a leather case containing his charts and that small notebook filled with constellation sketches. Sergeant Baumann lay near the destroyed radio equipment, and investigators noted something heartbreaking. In his frozen hands, he clutched photographs of his wife and 2 young daughters. The photos had been preserved by the cold and by the protective way he'd held them, as if shielding them from harm even as he died. The images were clear enough that researchers could see the faces of the family who'd waited for him, see the smiles of children who'd grown up without their father. Corporal Lange was in the rear section, and something about his position suggested he'd been thrown there by impact. His face showed fear, but also a kind of peace, as if he'd accepted what was happening. In his pockets, they found letters from home, written in the careful script of parents who'd known their son might not survive the war but had tried to fill his last months with love and normalcy. Identification was made quickly through dog tags and personal effects. Within 48 hours, the Austrian government had notified the German embassy, and researchers had begun the delicate process of contacting surviving family members. For the daughters of Otto Baumann, now in their 80s, the call brought both closure and renewed grief. Their father, missing for 79 years, had finally been found. For the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the other crew members, it was like receiving news of deaths that had happened generations ago, but were somehow still fresh. But as the excavation continued and the cargo section was exposed, the discovery took on new dimensions. The 6 steel crates that had been loaded onto Heinkel 584 the December morning had burst open on impact, just as they had in reality. But what spilled out across the crash site was far more than anyone had expected. It was evidence of criminality on a scale that would reshape understanding of the Third Reich's final days. The first crate's contents were scattered across a wide area, but many documents had been protected by waterproof containers that survived both the crash and 8 decades in the ice. Dr. Reinhardt, along with a team of archivists and historians, began the painstaking process of recovering and cataloging thousands of pages. What they found was staggering. These were financial records, meticulously maintained ledgers showing bank account numbers, transfer orders, and asset lists. Names of high-ranking Nazi officials appeared next to Swiss bank account information. Records of gold shipments to Argentina and Brazil. Lists of art stolen from across Europe with detailed notations about where it had been hidden. "This isn't military cargo," Dr. Reinhardt said, holding up a page that detailed the transfer of 47 kilograms of gold to a Buenos Aires bank in November 1944. This is evidence of the systematic looting of Europe and the escape planning of the Nazi elite. This was the paperwork for their exit strategy, their plan to survive the Reich's collapse with their wealth intact. The second and third crates held contents even more disturbing. Scientific research documents from facilities that should never have existed in official records. Detailed reports from medical experiments conducted on prisoners, complete with photographs and data tables. Chemical weapon formulas with notes about field testing. Results from human exposure to various toxic agents. Research into biological weapons that have been explicitly banned by international treaties Germany had signed. One document in particular made even hardened investigators feel ill. It was a research paper typed in precise German, titled Thermal Tolerance Studies on Subjects Exposed to Extreme Cold. The methodology described experiments where prisoners had been deliberately subjected to freezing temperatures, while researchers measured how long they survived. The conclusion recommended specific exposure durations for different tactical scenarios. It was signed by 3 doctors, their names recorded for posterity along with their crimes. The 4th crate contained physical evidence of the looting. Diamonds, gold bars stamped with various European bank seals, platinum, and jewelry. But it wasn't the monetary value that disturbed investigators. It was the nature of some of the items. Wedding rings, hundreds of them, many sized for small fingers. Gold teeth, extracted from victims. Jewelry with personal inscriptions. To my beloved Sarah, 1938. For Rosa, on our anniversary. Each piece represented a life stolen, a person murdered, a family destroyed. Dr. Reinhardt photographed everything methodically, but several times he had to stop work, overwhelmed by what he was documenting. These aren't just historical artifacts, he said to his team. These are crime scene evidence. Each piece represents a victim, and we have a responsibility to them. The team worked with renewed solemnity, understanding that their excavation was not just archaeology but an act of justice, however delayed. The 5th and 6th crates were perhaps most troubling from a historical perspective. They contained prototype weapons components and research documents into what modern analysts recognized as precursors to weapons of mass destruction. Chemical weapon precursors, carefully sealed in glass containers that had somehow survived the crash intact. Research documents describing biological agents. Most disturbing were schematics for what appeared to be a radiological weapon, a dirty bomb in modern terminology, designed to contaminate areas with radioactive material. The Reich was further along in unconventional weapons research than we'd previously understood. Dr. Reinhardt told a closed-door briefing with Austrian and German officials. These documents suggest they were actively developing chemical, biological, and radiological weapons right up until the collapse. This cargo was being moved out of Germany before the Allies could capture it, either to destroy evidence or to preserve it for future use. As the excavation concluded in late September 2023, the full picture began to emerge. Heinkel 584 hadn't been on a military mission at all. It had been part of a systematic effort to hide evidence and assets as the Reich collapsed. The aircraft had been loaded with the most incriminating possible cargo, financial records proving massive theft, scientific documents proving war crimes, physical evidence of genocide, and weapons research that violated international law. And the crew, 4 young men who'd known nothing about what they were carrying, had been selected for a mission they weren't meant to survive. The modifications to their radio equipment, the changed flight path, the deliberate isolation, all of it had been planned to ensure they and their cargo disappeared without trace. It was murder, coldly calculated and perfectly executed by men who considered it a routine operation, no more remarkable than destroying documents or burning files. The evidence for this conclusion came from multiple sources. First, the demolished radio equipment that Baumann had destroyed with an axe before he died. Investigators recovered enough components to reconstruct the kill switch mechanism. It was sophisticated, using 1940s technology but employing principles that wouldn't become common until decades later. Someone had put serious engineering effort into creating a device that could remotely disable an aircraft in flight. Second, they found Richter's navigation logs, carefully preserved in his leather case. The logs documented their actual flight path, including the mysterious course change and the secondary coordinates they'd been ordered to. When researchers plotted these coordinates, they found something chilling. The new destination wasn't Depot 7 or any other real facility. It was simply a point in the middle of the Alps, chosen because it was remote, inaccessible, and guaranteed to be fatal for an aircraft forced to land there. Third, and most damning, were records discovered in German military archives once investigators knew what to look for. The official logbook for Camp Geschwader 200 on December 18, 1944, showed no record of Raven 584's mission. The flight had been scrubbed from existence, the crew's assignment never logged, the aircraft's departure never noted. Someone had sanitized the records to ensure no evidence remained that this flight had ever occurred. But archivists found fragments that had escaped the purge. A maintenance log showed radio equipment installed on Heinkel 584 the night of December 17th, with an annotation that the work was classified, direct SS authorization. No documentation required. A fuel requisition form, incorrectly filed and thus missed during the record purge, showed the bomber had been loaded with enough fuel for a 900-kilometer flight, far more than needed for the supposed mission to Salzburg. Most damning was a decoded message found in captured Gestapo files that had been declassified in 2019 but never properly analyzed. The message, dated December 19, 1944, read, Package 584 contained. All evidence secured. Crew eliminated as planned. No further action required. Heil Hitler. The message was signed with a code name that researchers eventually traced to S. Obergruppenführer Maximilian Richthofen, a senior officer in the Reich Main Security Office, whose specialty had been cleanup operations, eliminating evidence and witnesses as the Reich collapsed. Further investigation revealed that Richthofen had been responsible for dozens of similar operations in late 1944 and early 1945. Aircraft that disappeared. Trucks that never reached their destinations. Ships that sank in shallow waters. Each one carrying evidence that could have been used to prosecute Nazi officials. Each one eliminated along with everyone who might have seen the cargo. Richthofen himself had been killed in Berlin in May 1945, either by Soviet troops or by suicide. He'd left no memoirs, no confession, just a trail of disappearances and a few cryptic messages. Dr. Reinhardt spent weeks piecing together the operation that had killed Weber and his crew. This was part of a systematic program called Action Wolkenbruch Operation Cloudburst, he explained in his preliminary report. As the Reich collapsed, certain officials became obsessed with hiding evidence of their crimes. They identified the most incriminating materials, financial records proving theft, scientific documents proving atrocities, physical evidence of genocide, and moved to destroy or hide everything. But they faced a problem, Reinhardt continued. Simply burning documents or dumping materials left traces. Witnesses remained. So they developed a more permanent solution. Take the evidence and the people who'd handled it, put them on aircraft or vehicles, send them to remote locations, and eliminate everything. Aircraft crashes in the Alps left no survivors and no accessible wreckage. The mountains became their disposal system. The report concluded with a chilling assessment. We believe at least 20 similar operations occurred between November 1944 and April 1945. Raven 584 is the first crash site we've been able to fully excavate and document. But Glacier Retreat is exposing others. Each one likely tells a similar story. Ordinary soldiers murdered to protect extraordinary crimes. The families of the 4 crew members, now represented by grandchildren and great-grandchildren who'd grown up with only stories and faded photographs, received this news with complex emotions. Relief that their ancestors had finally been found. Grief reopened after decades of partial healing. But also anger deep, justified anger at the casual evil that had murdered 4 young men to hide documents that would eventually be found anyway. Helga and Marguerite Baumann, now 85 and 83 respectively, traveled from Leipzig to Vienna to see where their father had been found. They stood at the crash site in October 2023, staring at the exposed rock where the glacier had been, trying to imagine their father's last moments. "He was just doing his job," Marguerite said quietly. "Following orders, trying to survive the war and come home to us. And they killed him like he was nothing, like his life meant nothing." Helga pulled out one of the photographs investigators had recovered from Otto's frozen hands, now carefully preserved in a climate-controlled case. It showed her and Marguerite as small children, maybe 6 and 4, smiling at the camera with their mother behind them. "He was holding this when he died," she said, tears streaming down her face. "85 years I've been alive, and I never knew my father. Mama died believing he'd come home. And all this time, he was up here, frozen, still holding our picture." The descendants of Hans Richter, Friedrich Weber, and Stefan Lange had similar reactions. They'd been robbed not just of their relatives, but of the truth about how they died. The lie of a training accident had denied them the knowledge that their family members had been victims of murder, had been betrayed by the system they'd served. A memorial service was held in Munich on November 18, 2023, exactly 79 years and 11 months after the crew's disappearance. The 4 men were buried with military honors in a ceremony that attracted international attention. But the service was complicated by difficult questions. Were they heroes who'd been betrayed or unwitting accomplices in a criminal operation? Should they receive full military honors from an air force that had murdered them? The German government struggled with this. The Luftwaffe had committed countless crimes during the war, had participated in genocide, had bombed civilians deliberately. But these 4 men had been victims of that same system, murdered to hide evidence of crimes they'd known nothing about. After lengthy debate, it was decided they would receive honors not as Luftwaffe airmen, but as victims of Nazi criminality. The memorial plaque, placed at their graves, reads, "Captain Friedrich Weber, Lieutenant Hans Richter, Sergeant Otto Baumann, Corporal Stefan Lange, 4 airmen who died not in combat, but as victims of the regime they served. They were murdered to protect secrets that justice has finally exposed. May their story remind us that evil systems destroy not only their enemies, but their own people as well." The documents recovered from Raven 584's cargo led to ongoing investigations across multiple countries. Swiss banks were compelled to search for accounts listed in the financial records. Several were found still active, containing assets that were eventually distributed to Holocaust survivors and descendant organizations. Art pieces listed in the looted treasures documents were traced to private collections in South America, leading to repatriation cases that continue as of 2024. The weapons research documents were turned over to international agencies studying the history of weapons of mass destruction. Historians used them to fill gaps in understanding of Nazi weapons programs, revealing how close the Reich had come to developing agents that could have prolonged the war or been used in terrorist attacks by die-hard Nazis after the collapse. Most significantly, the scientific research documents provided evidence for ongoing investigations into Nazi medical crimes. Several doctors named in the documents had never been prosecuted, had lived quietly in post-war Germany or abroad under their real names. 3 were still alive in 23, all in their late 90s or early 100s. War crimes prosecutors in Germany moved to charge them, knowing that at their ages they'd likely die before trials concluded. But the principle mattered. Crimes don't expire, and justice, however delayed, must be pursued. Dr. Anna Hoffman returned to the crash site regularly throughout late 2023 and 2024, monitoring the continued glacier retreat and watching as the landscape transformed. By summer 2024, the Grunwald Glacier had retreated another 35 meters vertically and 90 meters in length. The ice field that had hidden Raven 584 for 79 years was disappearing at catastrophic speed. Climate change is both revealing and erasing history, she said during an interview in July 2024. The warming that exposed Raven 584 is the same warming that's destroying glaciers worldwide. We're getting glimpses into the past just as that past is being obliterated. Every glacier that melts is like opening and burning a library simultaneously. She paused, looking at the barren rock where ancient ice had been. I think about those 4 men sometimes, frozen here for nearly 8 decades while the world moved on. They were just boys, really. Weber was 28, but he'd already lived through so much horror. Richter was 23 and wanted to study stars. Baumann was 32, just wanted to go home to his wife and daughters. Lange was 19, still a teenager. None of them deserved what happened. Dr. Reinhardt published his comprehensive report on Raven 584 in January 2024. It ran to 467 pages and included detailed analysis of the cargo, the crew, the kill switch mechanism, and the broader Operation Cloudburst program. The report received international attention, was translated into 8 languages, and became required reading in university courses on World War II history and ethics. In his conclusion, Reinhardt wrote, "The story of Heikel 584 reminds us that the Nazi regime's crimes extended beyond the concentration camps and the battlefields. They created a culture where human life had no intrinsic value, where murder was administrative procedure, where 4 young men could be casually eliminated because they'd become inconvenient. The crew of Raven 584 were victims of industrialized evil, killed not out of hatred but out of cold calculation. But their story also reminds us," he continued, "that secrets don't stay buried forever. Truth has a way of emerging, whether through the patient work of historians or through the literal melting away of the ice that concealed it. The men who murdered Weber, Richter, Baumann, and Lange believed they'd hidden their crimes permanently. Instead, they merely delayed discovery by 8 decades. Justice for these 4 men comes too late to matter to them, but it matters to their families, to history, and to our collective understanding of what happened during humanity's darkest chapter. Every document recovered, every bank account traced, every stolen artwork returned, every war criminal prosecuted. These are the victories that give meaning to their deaths." The Austrian government designated the crash site as a protected historical location in March 2024, though there was debate about what this meant given that the glacier was disappearing. In the end, they settled on protecting the landscape itself, the rock formations and valleys that had witnessed the tragedy, even if the ice that had preserved it was gone. A small museum opened in the nearby village of Malnitz in June 2024, displaying artifacts from the crash site and telling the story of Raven 584. The exhibits are careful and thoughtful, focusing on the human cost rather than sensationalizing the discovery. Visitors can see Richter's constellation notebook, carefully preserved behind glass, Baumann's photographs of his family, letters Lange had carried from his parents, Weber's pilot's logbook, recovered from the wreckage and still showing his final entries before the fatal mission. The museum also displays some of the cargo, though the most sensitive materials remain in government archives. Visitors can see examples of the financial documents, the looted treasures, the weapons research. Each exhibit includes context about what these materials meant, how they'd been created, why they'd been hidden. The message is clear. This wasn't just an aircraft crash. This was evidence of systematic criminality by a regime that murdered millions. School groups visit regularly, German and Austrian students learning about their country's history through the lens of 4 young men who'd been sacrificed to hide that history. Teachers use Raven 584 as a case study in how authoritarian systems betray their own people, how following orders isn't always the right choice, how ordinary individuals can become victims of extraordinary evil. In Berlin, a monument was erected in November 2024, honoring all the victims of Operation Cloudburst, the Nazi program that had eliminated witnesses and evidence as the Reich collapsed. The monument lists names where known, including Weber, Richter, Baumann, and Lange. For many others, there are just question marks, representing people who disappeared and were never identified. Estimates suggest several hundred people were killed. In cloudburst operations, their deaths disguised as combat losses or accidents. The families of the Raven 584 crew have formed a small association with descendants of other cloudburst victims. They meet annually, share stories, support ongoing research, and lobby for continued investigation into what happened in the Reich's final months. They've worked with the German government to ensure the documents recovered from crash sites remain accessible to researchers and the public. Truth, they believe, is the only honor they can truly give to people who died protecting secrets they never knew they carried. And there's something powerful in that, in transforming the intended cover-up into a tool of education, in using the evidence that was meant to stay hidden as proof of crimes that must never be forgotten. As for the glacier itself, it continues its retreat. By 2025, climate scientists estimate that the Grunwald Glacier will have lost 60% of its mass compared to 1900. By 2050, it may be gone entirely, just bare rock and memories of what once was. Other glaciers in the region are experiencing similar fates, each one potentially hiding secrets from the past. Dr. Hoffman has identified at least 6 other potential aircraft crash sites exposed by glacier retreat in the Austrian Alps alone. Ground-penetrating radar suggests these may be similar to Raven 584 aircraft that vanished mysteriously in the war's final months, possibly victims of the same elimination program. Excavations are planned for 2025 and beyond, each one potentially revealing more victims, more evidence, more pieces of a puzzle that's taken 8 decades to begin solving. But time is running out. As glaciers melt, they expose artifacts, but continued melting and exposure to weather destroys those same artifacts. Materials preserved for decades in ice deteriorate rapidly once exposed to air, moisture, and temperature fluctuations. There's a race against time to document and preserve what the ice is revealing before it's lost forever. We're in a unique moment in history, Dr. Hoffman says. For a brief window, maybe 20 or 30 years, we have access to materials that have been sealed away for millennia. After that, they'll be gone, destroyed by the same climate change that revealed them. We have a responsibility to future generations to document everything we can while we still have the chance. On a cold December morning in 2024, exactly 80 years after Raven 584 took off on its final mission, descendants of all 4 crew members gathered at the crash site. There were about 30 people, total grandchildren, great-grandchildren, even. A few great-great-grandchildren who'd never met the men they were honoring but felt connected to them through family stories and shared grief. They stood at the site where the bomber had struck the glacier, now just exposed rock with a few patches of remnant ice in shaded areas. The wind at morning was bitter, cutting through their winter clothing, making them understand a fraction of what those 4 airmen had experienced in their final moments. Someone had brought flowers, though they seemed absurd in this harsh landscape. Someone else had brought 4 small stones, each engraved with a name and dates. Weber, Richter, Baumann, Lange. The stones were placed on the rock, a memorial more permanent than flowers, though even stone wouldn't last forever. Marguerite Baumann, now 84 and frail, spoke briefly. My father was a good man who followed orders because the alternative was death. He tried to do his duty and come home to his family. They murdered him for it. I spent my whole life not knowing what happened to him, and now I know, and it's both better and worse than I imagined. She paused, looking at the barren landscape. But at least now I know. At least now he's not missing anymore. He's home, buried with honors, and his story is told. That's something. That's more than we had for 80 years. A young woman, maybe 25, one of Stefan Lange's great-great-granddaughters, placed her hand on the rock. I never met my great-great-grandfather, she said. He died 50 years before I was born. But his story shaped my family. We grew up knowing that terrible things had happened, that good people had been murdered by evil systems. It made us careful about power, about authority, about following orders without thinking. She looked at the others gathered there. Maybe that's what we take from this. Not just that 4 men died unfairly, but that systems can turn evil, that following orders isn't always right, that we have to think and question and stand up when something's wrong, even if it costs us. As the sun set over the Austrian Alps on that December evening, casting long shadows across the bare rock where a glacier had once stood. You could almost hear the distant echo of aircraft engines. 4 young men flying through a winter storm, following orders, trusting their superiors, having no idea they'd been sentenced to death. The ghost of a bomber that never completed its mission, forever searching for a destination that was always meant to be their grave. But the ice has given up its secrets now. The glacier that hid them has melted away, taking with it the silence that protected their murderers. The truth, frozen for 79 years, has finally thawed. And 4 names that were meant to be erased Weber, Richter, Baumann, Lange, are now remembered, honored, and used to teach future generations about the cost of unchecked power and the price of secrets kept too long. The mountains remain, silent witnesses to all that has been lost in the passage of time and the melting of ice. But they no longer keep the secret of Raven 584. That story has been told, and in the telling, 4 young men who died as victims have been transformed into symbols of resistance against tyranny, even if that resistance came only in death, in the evidence they unknowingly carried, in the truth that survived their murder. High above the site, stars become visible in the darkening sky. Richter's stars, the ones he'd loved and sketched and dreamed about. They shine down on the place where he died, indifferent to human drama but beautiful nonetheless. The universe is bigger than any war, he'd written to his sister. That's real. That's eternal. Everything else is just noise. And perhaps he was right. The Reich that murdered him lasted 12 years and left nothing but ruins and horror. But the stars still shine. Truth still matters. And 4 young men who were meant to be forgotten are now remembered. Their story a warning and a lesson that echoes across the decades. Carried not by ice, but by memory, by justice, and by the simple human need to ensure that those who died wrongly are not erased from history.